Welcome to the first part of the portrait of Liv with the limited earth palette. So right now I am putting up the colors that I have mixed on my mixing palette, which is just a little easier to mix bulk colors than to start from scratch on a vertical palette. So here I am laying out on the top row ivory black, patchouli red, yellow ochre and white. And then I have my shadow shape mixtures along with the background mixture and some of the light shape mixtures. And I will later on expand on some of the colors as I'm expressing the areas of the shawl, for instance. So now I'm just blocking in the portrait. And the scale of this panel is 6 by 9 inches, which is about 15 by 22 centimeters. And I'm just blocking in with one of the mixtures that I have here, which is just black and a little bit of red, kind of forming a type of brown color. And I am placing here such a relatively small amount of color that it won't really have any interference on the other colors, as I will be working with this portrait for the duration of one painting session. So I'm just first thinking about the large abstract shapes. I'm not thinking about shading right now. I'm just thinking about getting some sense of the gesture and proportion and some sense of where the portrait will be within the framework of the composition. So now I have a hog hair bristle brush that has a nice sort of strength and snap to it. So it can apply paint with somewhat of a more vigor than a soft hairbrush, such as a sable hairbrush. I'm just scumbling in some initial passages of color and value that exists in the light shape. It's almost mostly just to create some kind of wet paint positioned here so that I have something to paint into as I will be advancing this portrait. I like to make somewhat of a distinction, so if I do see a slight shift to a color and a value in a given area, I try to avoid insisting on placing the wrong color value in that zone for the sake of simplification. So in the area of the chest, I did indicate that there is this darker value also within the clavicle area. It's not just one white value. So now I'm scumbling in the area of the shawl, and for this painting and this portrait it's going to be really interesting to see how far I can push the identity of the particular color and temperature that exists on the shawl. So since I just have a yellow ochre and black and white as my blue, that's the only kind of combination that I have to express the green and the lime green element. But I have to be careful not to kill the chroma with too much black or white. So for now I just scumbled in a mixture there that was fairly absent of white. Most it consisted just of ochre and black. And while I may not be able to find exactly the color and temperature indication or translation of the lime green and highly chromatic shawl, I do have a confidence that I'll be able to express the correct values and of course the gesture and proportion. So that is really going to carry this portrait forward as well. So as I'm just scumbling in some of the color values on the chest right now, I'm also gradually expanding on the slight variations that I am seeing. So I'm building up with very, very thin layers of paint right now. I'm not really applying any sort of thick amount of paint. So I have a high ratio of flexibility moving forward. And I also do want to echo some of the variations that I am seeing straight away so that I have that foundation to build upon. So now just massing in the dark of her hair, that helps to also create a framework for the light shape and enables me to see how the proportion of the light shape of her face relates to the neck and the chest area. And this also is tied with the big impression. So when we are looking at the big impression, we are evaluating the larger relationships of mass and value as it pertains to the proportion and also the gesture. So next up is bringing in a color and value for the background. And I could have decided to include the background before really advancing anything in the light shape of her chest. But it's interesting to see now that I'm bringing in this darker note, how it has an immediate impact on some of the darker values that exist on the darker side of her chest. We can see how they seemed maybe dark enough in relationship to the light background, but now bringing in this darker value in the background, we can immediately see the rich potential it is in that zone to also push those values darker. This is also the reason why I have, for now, just left the area where the shawl has a bit of a shadow blank, because I just wanted to have the anchor point of the background in place before I introduce that value. Also just to make sure that I'm not leaving an area that has the potential of a dark value as too light. And then in reference to the value that is on the clavicle area, that will become darker because it is such a relatively small amount of paint that is there now. Again, I have a high degree of flexibility, so it's not my objective to be 100% accurate straight away. I find it is much more important to make good decisions that will create a good foundation to build upon. So I don't need it to be exact, I just need it to be in the ballpark, and for me to create something to compare with. And so even if, let's say, a shape is off or color or value is off, that's okay. The fact that one have a statement will make a comparison to nature possible. And as long as one have somewhat of a flexibility to the medium, then it is fairly straightforward to make these adjustments towards the development of the portrait. It's all about relativity. So relative to what I have, I'm moving along in a good way. And relative to what I see in nature, for example, there will be more of a complete value in the background, and some of the values on her will, for instance, become a bit darker and also richer in temperature. But this is so far so good in terms of creating a format to build upon. I'm keeping it quite general right now, but I do keep the overall large proportions in the ballpark of the destinations. And I find this is helpful too, as there is a fairly strong contrast between the light on her and the yellow and the light of the shawl and the dark blue of the background. So I don't want to mess with those contours too much. So in terms of those contours, I want to have a fairly close approximation to the final destination in the early stages, so that I can avoid having to move a darker zone into an area that I have white paint or vice versa. And that again ties in with maintaining flexibility of the portrait and of the painting as it advances. So there is a slight gradient in the background, moving from almost like just pure black in the darkest zones, and then in the area on the higher part of the upper part of the portrait, as well as the area behind her head, there is a slightly cool and slightly lighter color value in the background. And because I don't have an actual blue on the palette, the black and white in combination with each other is the blue. So the black has a dual function. It represents the darkest element of the value spectrum, and together with white, it also represents the blue color of the color wheel. And I find that the blue that black and white produces has a natural harmony with earth red and ochre. So I masked in the background using hog hair brushes, and I'm just flattening out the texture, going over with a dry red sable brush. And I'm really just using this then to manipulate the direction and the surface of the paint. And here I have another sable brush that I'm actually adding some paint with. And because this is a fairly small scale and relatively small amount of paint, it's effective to also use a sable brush for this. But I rarely will use sable brushes in the scumbling or with scumbling technique, because it really wears on the brush, but it's also much less effective for scumbling application than a hog hair bristle brush is. But in this situation, I am adding dollops of paint. I'm also avoiding adding a bunch of medium in the painting process. So you see, I'm mostly just picking up a amount of paint directly on the brush and depositing it on the painting. So I'm not really adding any medium. And because I'm painting directly on a fairly light ground here, I want to make sure that I am able to express fairly opaque layers in the early stages as well, because this is just going to be one painting session, or a painting that I will begin and complete in one day. And so in order to make sure that I can express the darkest potential of some of these values, I avoid diluting the pigment and the paint with oil, because it will make it harder to actually express the darkest potential of the paint. This is something that also depends a little bit on the type of ground that one are painting on and the absorbency of the canvas or panel or ground. But being familiar with the Jack Richardson panels, I know that they can both have a slight tendency of absorbing quite a bit, but also letting the paint slide around, kind of ice skating, if there is too much medium there. And so especially for the darks, I avoid that as much as possible. I will, if I am converting a brush to a different color value sort of essence, then I will maybe dip the brush in some oil and then just wipe it with a paper towel. So that's just the amount of oil that I'm using. It's almost just to clean my brush as I am painting. Since this scale is fairly small, I know that I will be able to cover the whole surface in this session. And so I have activated sort of all the areas, but I also permitted myself to push the hair somewhat further along than the portrait. There is still some degree of flexibility to it, so if I do find that I have to adjust the drawing or the color and the value after the portrait itself has been developed, I still have the flexibility to do so. If this was a larger portrait that would require more time per area, I might have just simplified the hair a little bit more. But because this is a small scale, I was able to express the hair in a fairly detailed sense in a fairly early stage with a high degree of efficiency. So I'm not lingering on any area for too long of a time, because of course I do want to fill in the whole surface and develop everything together. So with the internal element of the portrait, I had just indicated the outline as expressed by the jawline and the hairline and the shadow shape edge. Then I just developed the features a little bit more with a emphasis on the eyebrows and the position of the eyes and how that links up and relates to the shadow shape of the nose. And I just indicated 3 little points now representing the mouth. That would be the corners of the mouth and the slight shadow or halftone that exists below the bottom lip. That's a very effective way of just mapping out the proportions and the placement of the mouth without having to go into full-on detail. So for now, these are just placeholders. In order to be able to judge the light shape of the clavicle and chest better, it is helpful to indicate some of the darkest color values that helps to frame it, which is why I'm creating that contour of the shawl. And it also helps to create some dimension, I think, straight away, as we see the design of the shawl kind of resting on the structure of the body. So now I am introducing the transitional halftone that exists on the shadow shape side, and this is going to be a rather cool temperature. And I will say that overall this reference material and the light effect and the kind of color theme of this composition is tending towards a quite cool temperature range, where we have that slight hint of lime green on the yellow of the shawl, and we have a very blue and dark background. And I would say that her shadow shape is also relatively cool in this situation. And of course there are some warmer temperatures within this range, but mainly in her skin. There will be some more pink and slight orange elements there, along with some nice cool statements of her complexion as well. So even within the spectrum of temperatures that is overall tinting quite cool, there is of course a rich range and variation between the different color expressions and warm and cool. So we still have a range of warm and cool, even if it's all within a cool spectrum. So now, turning my attention back to the shawl, I am going in with the shadow shape on the shadow shape side, and that is just black and red. And now I'm also introducing a halftone on the light shape side. And this halftone has a slightly sort of greenish, grayish hint to it. So I'm using mostly black and ochre in that area. And when I find that it becomes too green of an expression, I can neutralize it slightly with red. So warming it up slightly with the red. So there is a hint of red in moments in the shawl, although I would say that for the most part there will be yellow ochre and then with some tint of black here and there, and then there will be a bit of red in the moments when I need to express some more warmth in the shawl. So I have been talking about how the black is the blue on the palette in this limited earth palette, but I'm actually avoiding including any amount of white in the shawl. And this is because white in this situation would also reduce the chromatic integrity of the ochre, and it would make it a little bit pastier. So I try to use just the ochre almost as the white as well, because of course when ochre and black is mixed together, the opacity of the ochre also pushes out some of the cooler undertones of the black. So while the ochre doesn't really quite operate exactly like white does, they share some properties. So black together with yellow expresses a little bit more of a green temperature, which is what I'm going for. Whereas if I mixed black and white, I would get blue, which theoretically mixed with yellow would be a green. But in this situation, the white would reduce the little chroma that I need, in a way, that I have here, too much. So in order to preserve the chromatic integrity as much as possible, I'm therefore basing my mixtures mostly on ochre. So I have this base then, which is a tint of black and ochre, and then hints of red in areas. And as I am pushing some of the more intense qualities of this color, I just find that I had to add more yellow into the wet paint. So while I am not able to achieve quite the lime green color that exists in the source material, I'm able to convey that there is a dark shawl that has a slight greenish tint to it, and it has a strong chroma as well compared to the flesh tints. And while I'm not able to express the color in a verbatim way, I'm able to push the value scale to its sort of designated potential. So I'm going as dark as I can in the shadow shape side, and I'm letting those dark halftones follow suit. And since the ratio of black increase in those darker temperatures, they can tend a little bit to green as well, so I'm keeping that sort of green undertone in check with tempering it with whispers of red where appropriate. I'm using a hog hair bristle brush for this paint application. I believe this is my Winton brush that I have right here. And along with a couple of other brushes as well. So I have this smaller sable hair brush where I can go into with a little bit more intricate detail, and also in zones I don't want to have the same degree of texture. This is quite handy. But for where I want to build up a little bit more texture and think a little bit more broadly, I'm using that larger hog hair bristle brush. Now I did add just a hint of that mixture that does contain white. So on the bottom row, the color value that is on the far right, that is a combination of black and white and ochre. So I'm including a hint of it where I intend to cool down the temperature a little bit more, and I can afford to include a little bit of white without reducing the chroma too much. around the edge. I want to make sure that I am pushing the potential of those darkest transitional halftones to their maximum in order to optimize the illusion of the form turning right there. So therefore I'm relying mostly on ochre and black, as well as my diffuser brush in order to develop a softer turn right there. Now, depending on the ochre that one uses, that would also yield different results. And I find that with the Blue Ridge Yellow Ochre by Rublev Colors, that is a natural ochre. It is sourced from Blue Ridge Mountains. I think it is in America that this is existing. Anyway, it's a really beautiful ochre. It's my favorite ochre. While it is a natural ochre, it has a really beautiful chroma. Michael Harding ochre is also quite nice and chromatic, but that is a synthetic iron oxide. And in the end of the day, it doesn't really matter so much. I use a little bit of both, so I'm not a stickler for it having to be a natural iron oxide. But when there is a natural iron oxide that does express itself in a beautiful color value, I do like using it. Also because of the possibility that a natural iron oxide will have a irregular pigment shape and size, which can be a benefit for the painting, whereas a lot of synthetic made pigments tend to have a smaller particle size. So this is why I tend to use natural iron oxides when I find a color that works in a way that I enjoy working with. So this is Blue Ridge Yellow Ochre by Rublev Colors, and in this painting I'm also using their Putsuli Red, and that is a iron oxide also. I believe it is sourced from a location in Italy. So now that I have the framework of the shawl, I have the context for her light. So in the early stages, so the first moments of this painting, I actually did include some color and value notes for her light and for her skin colors. And then I needed to change gears and let the background catch up and let the shawl catch up. And that in turn had to lead the way. And now that the background and the shawl has established a good context, I can now shift my focus and my attention to the area of the chest again. And I think it's really lovely with some of these cooler temperatures. So I want to also see how far I can, in a way, push those cooler notes in relationship to the yellow and chromatic yellow of the shawl. And this is as chromatic as I'm able to go with the shawl. It cannot go any more chromatic than this. So right around the immediate framework of the shawl, where the shawl frames her light shape, for the most part, I'm just using pure ochre right there. So that is the most chromatic version of the yellow that I will be able to express. And so it's interesting to have that noted so that I can then judge where the coolest notes of the temperature of her complexion relate in comparison to that yellow accent. So while everything is sort of tinting towards cool in this composition, and we are seeing here a composition that is based on two major color categories, I would say blue and yellow. There is some subtle red undertones here that mostly express themselves in her complexion as well as in her hair. And then there's moments of red in the shawl as well as moments of cool, of course, in her complexion. So we can say that there are 3 major color categories here, and also maybe 3 major value categories, with the background being very dark, her hair being very dark, her shawl being a bit of a mid-tone, and then of course her light shape being the lightest mass and value. But even within her light, we see a variation of light and dark, and we also see a variation of cool and warm. So now that I am building up more application of paint and brushstrokes in the area of her chest, I'm also adding now a little bit more, a larger amount of paint as I move along. And this is because I can afford to lose the flexibility, because I have more of a direction to where the gesture, proportion, color, and value and shape design is heading. Now, while I'm adding a little bit more texture right here, I am using a soft hair sable brush. So I am developing quite smooth transitions, and then there may be some textural anecdotes that will make the form pop in some select zones. Now this is also an attribution of painting on panel, of course. Since panel has a very smooth surface, one can easily build up texture and visible brushstrokes. So if I was painting on canvas, it would require a larger amount of paint to develop the sort of equal amount of texture as I'll be able to achieve on a panel. So while I'm adding a nice amount of paint here, it's not impasto. I wouldn't categorize it as such. So there is still a relative degree of flexibility. So I can still paint into something that is, in order to make it a little bit lighter or darker or cooler. So I can still push all of those elements around as I move forward. So I decided to develop the area of the chest a bit before moving into the area of the portrait. Partly this, again, has to do with the scale of this portrait, because it is relatively small. So I find that once I move into the area of the portrait, that will be relatively intricate because of its small scale size. It is nice to have the big impression overall in place, so that I can make good judgment in terms of the color and the value that I will be developing the portrait with. And although there is quite a lot of variation in the area of the chest, it is relatively straightforward compared to the intricacy of the drawing that exists in the portrait. And so for that reason, I also found it conducive in this situation to develop the surrounding zones in front of the portrait itself. This will help to guide the portrait forward once I go into that zone. So part 1 is about to come to a conclusion. Please tune in to part 2 to see the continuation of this painting process and painting session.